Look at him, planting sticks in the mud like they're gonna grow into something. The men at the fence were laughing. A 16-year-old boy knelt at the edge of Coldwater Creek, pressing bare willow cuttings into the cold ground, one after another, hundreds of them, and he did not look up. Boy, that creek floods every few years. Whatever you plant there washes straight to Tennessee. Waste of a good afternoon, if you ask me. Nobody asked him what he was doing. Nobody asked why a kid everybody had already written off would spend 2 years on something that looked like nothing. But 2 years later, when the worst flood in decades came roaring down off the mountains, those sticks did the impossible. What did he see that no one else could? If stories about quiet patience, real farming, and the things the land teaches us mean something to you, take a second and subscribe. And tell us down in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to know who's out there. Now let's get back to the creek. The people of Casey County, Kentucky had a way of measuring a family before they ever measured a boy. And by that arithmetic, the Brooks farm had always come out small. It sat at the eastern edge of town where the paved road gave up and turned to gravel. 40 acres of tired pasture and a stand of tobacco that never quite paid what the almanacs promised. Marcus and Denise Brooks worked it the way their own parents had worked it, with more hours than money, and their son Elijah had grown up understanding that whatever the family had, it had been earned twice over, once against the weather, and once against the quiet arithmetic of people who had already decided what a family like theirs could amount to. Elijah Brooks was 16 that autumn, and he was not a boy who filled a room. His older cousins were louder, quicker with a joke, faster to be liked. Elijah kept to the margins, and the margins suited him, because the margins were where the interesting things happened. He was the one who walked the creek line before the school bus came, not because anyone had told him to, but because he liked to see what the water had done overnight. He noticed things the way other people noticed weather, which is to say, without effort and without pride. He had known the south pasture was draining slower a full season before his father said a word about it. He had found a heifer down near the fence and traced the trouble back to a sagging wire while the rest of the family was still finishing breakfast. None of that earned him much in town. What people saw, when they saw him at all, was a quiet black kid from the poor farm at the end of the gravel road, and they filled in the rest without asking. He had learned early that there was no percentage in arguing with what people had already decided. It was easier to let the land do the talking, because the land did not care who your father was or how much your tobacco brought at auction. The land only cared whether you paid attention. Elijah paid attention. What he loved, more than anything a boy his age was supposed to love, was the way the ground held together or came apart. He kept a shelf of county extension pamphlets in his room, the cheap kind printed on soft paper, and he read them the way other boys read box scores. Soil structure, root density, the slow, patient business of keeping earth where it belonged. He could not have told you why it pulled at him. It simply did. When a hard rain cut a new gully across the low field, most people saw mud and a nuisance. Elijah saw a question, and he wanted to know the answer. Coldwater Creek ran along the northern edge of the Brooks land and then bent away toward town, and it had a temper. Every few years it jumped its banks and took whatever was closest, a stretch of fence, a corner of somebody's meadow, a load of topsoil that had taken a decade to build. The older farmers spoke about it the way people speak about a bad knee, as a fact of life that could be complained about but not fixed. The creek did what it wanted. Everyone agreed on that. It was the closest thing the county had to gospel. Elijah did not believe it, though he was careful not to say so. He had walked those banks his whole life, and he had come to think that the creek was not a temper at all, but a set of forces, and that forces could be answered if you understood them. He did not have the understanding yet. He only had the beginning of it, the itch of a question that would not leave him alone, and a growing sense that the men at the feed store who laughed about the creek had simply stopped looking at it a long time ago. His mother understood this about him better than his father did. Denise Brooks kept the farm's books and grew the finest kitchen garden in 3 townships, and she recognized in her son the same stubbornness that had kept her own Rose straight through 40 dry summers. When Elijah went quiet at supper and stared at nothing, she did not ask what was wrong. She knew he was somewhere out along the water, working something over. His father was harder to read. Marcus Brooks was a practical man who had learned the hard way that hope was expensive, and he watched his son's fascination with the creek the way he watched a sky that could go either way. He neither encouraged it nor stood in its way. He only said more than once that a farm did not run on daydreams, and that whatever Elijah got up to along that water had better not come at the cost of the chores that kept the family fed. The thing that turned a boy's quiet fascination into something with a shape had happened the summer before, in the 2 weeks Elijah spent across the county with an old man named Lester Bowen. Bowen was 74 and mostly done with the world's opinion of him. For 30 years, he had worked as a soil conservation technician, driving a state truck from farm to farm and teaching men who did not want to be taught how to stop losing ground they could not afford to lose. He had retired to a small place with a good porch, and when the county extension office asked whether he would take on a teenager for a summer, he had agreed mostly out of curiosity. He was not a warm man in the ordinary way, but he recognized attention when he saw it, and the Brooks boy had it in a measure Bowen had rarely seen in someone that age. For 2 weeks they walked. Bowen showed him how to read a slope, how to tell settled ground from ground that was only pretending, how water moved when nobody was watching it. Elijah asked questions that were better than the answers he expected, and the old man found himself talking more than he had in years. The evening that mattered came near the end, when Bowen took him down to a neighbor's place where a creek had gone wrong. The bank there looked as though something had taken a spoon to the earth, whole sections scooped away and carried off, a raw, ugly wound running the length of the property. Elijah stood at the edge of it and felt something close to grief, though he could not have named it that. Bowen let the silence do its work for a while, and then he asked the boy whether he knew what fixed a thing like that. Elijah admitted that he did not. Willows. The word landed like a small stone dropped in still water. He explained it the way a man explains something he has watched with his own eyes across a working life. You planted them close along the bank, cut straight from a living tree, nothing more than bare shoots pressed into wet soil. You gave them 2 years, 3 if the ground was poor. And underneath, where nobody can see it happen, the roots go down and out. They lace themselves through the soil till the whole bank's held together from below. Water can rise and push all it wants. It won't meet a wall it can break. It meets something that bends and holds. The old man handed him a thin pamphlet from the extension service before he left, its edges soft from years of handling. Streambank stabilization using native vegetation. Elijah read it twice on the bus ride home, and by the time the county rolled past the window, he understood it the way he understood the fence line, not as a theory printed on cheap paper, but as something that would matter, someday, to a piece of ground he cared about. He carried it through the rest of that summer without saying much, but he had already begun to see Coldwater Creek differently, the way you see a locked door once someone has shown you where the key is kept. By the time the willows could be cut and planted, autumn had come, and Elijah had made up his mind. He had a little money saved, earned across 2 summers of hauling and stacking hay for the Atchison place down the road, dollar by dollar, the way a boy saves when there is nothing extra to fall back on. He spent nearly all of it, ordering hundreds of bare willow cuttings from a conservation nursery 2 counties over, and when the bundles arrived, he asked his father for permission to work the creek bank. Marcus Brooks looked at the sticks, and then at his son for a long moment. Long as it doesn't come out of your chores. And that was as much blessing as Elijah needed. He started before school and finished after, day after day, pressing the whips into the soft ground one every few feet, dozens and then hundreds of them, running from the old fence post near the pasture gate along the whole bending length of the creek toward the edge of town. His boots were ruined inside a week. His hands blistered and then hardened. It did not take long for the county to notice, and it did not take long for the county to laugh. A boy planting bare sticks in the mud along a creek everyone knew flooded out every few years, with winter coming in hard and not a leaf on any of them. It was the kind of thing that got told at the feed store and repeated at church. Some of the younger ones came down to the water with their phones and made their little videos, and the clips went around the local pages the way small cruelties do. The Brooks boy planting broom handles. It sounded, people agreed, about right for him. The laughter would have stopped a lot of people, and for a few days it nearly stopped Elijah too. He was not made of stone, whatever the town decided about him. He heard the things that were said. He knew about the videos the way a person always knows, and there was a night that first week when he sat on the edge of his bed with dirt still under his nails and turned the whole thing over and asked himself honestly whether he was the fool everyone had decided he was. It would have been easy to quit. That was the part nobody in town understood. Quitting was right there, warm and available, and it came with a story that would let him off the hook. He could pull the cuttings, say he had learned his lesson, and let the county move on to the next thing worth laughing at. The creek would take the bank eventually, the way it always had, and no one would remember by spring that he had tried. What kept him from it was not stubbornness, though it looked like stubbornness from the outside. It was the pamphlet, and the old man's voice, and the raw, scooped-out bank 2 counties over that had shown him what the water did when nothing stood in its way. He had seen the answer with his own eyes. He knew, in the particular way that a person knows a true thing before he can prove it, that the Willows would work if they were only given time. The problem was that time was exactly what the county would not grant him. Nobody laughs at a finished thing. They laugh at the 2 years in between, when the work looks like nothing and the proof has not come. So the choice in front of him was not really about Willows. It was about whether he could stand 2 years of being wrong in everyone's eyes for the sake of being right in the end. Alone, with no one to tell him he had judged it correctly. His mother found him at the water one gray afternoon, hood up against the cold, tamping the soil around a fresh cutting with the heel of his boot. She did not ask him whether the talk in town was bothering him because she knew it was, and she knew he knew she knew. She only stood beside him for a while and looked at the thin line of sticks running along the bank. "You sure about this?" And it was not quite a question. "No, but I'm sure about the reason." Denise Brooks considered that, and then she nodded, because it was a better answer than certainty would have been. She had raised him to tell the difference between the two, and it pleased her, in a way she did not show, to hear that it had taken. His father said less, as his father always did. But one evening, Marcus stood at the edge of the field and watched his son work in the fading light, and he did not call him in, and he did not tell him he was wasting his time. He only watched, and something in the watching was its own kind of permission. That was enough. Elijah made the decision the way he made most of his decisions, quietly and without announcing it to anyone. He would see it through. He would give the Willows their 2 years, no matter what the county said in the meantime, and he would carry the laughing the way he carried the blisters, as a cost of the work rather than a verdict on it. He stopped checking the local pages. He stopped bracing for the comments at the feed store. He let the talk wash over him and slide off, and he put his attention where it had always belonged, which was on the ground, and the water, and the slow, invisible thing he had set in motion beneath the surface. The trees would either hold or they would not. The roots would either lace through the bank the way Lester Bowen had promised, or they would fail, and no amount of laughing or believing would change which. That was what he trusted in the end. Not himself exactly, and certainly not the county's opinion of him. He trusted the plain mechanics of it, the fact that a willow root did not know or care who had planted it, and that the water, when it finally came, would not be asking anyone's opinion either. He pressed the last cutting of the day into the mud, tamped it firm, and walked back up toward the house as the first hard cold of winter settled over Coldwater Creek. The first winter was brutal to the Willows, and it was brutal in a way that felt personal, though Elijah knew better than to think the weather had opinions. A hard freeze came in January, harder than the county had seen in years, and it killed back a good number of the cuttings outright. Elijah went down to the water one morning and found whole stretches of what he had planted gone black and brittle. The bark split, the wood dead all the way through. He walked the line the way a man walks a field after hail, counting the losses without letting himself feel them yet, because feeling them would not put a single one back. When he had finished counting, he stood there a while in the cold, and then he went up to the barn and started figuring out what he could still save. What he could still save, it turned out, was more than the freeze had left standing. He had learned enough from the old man to know that a willow was a generous plant, that a living cutting taken from healthy stock would root in nothing more than a bucket of creek water if you gave it light and patience. So through the worst of that winter, Elijah kept a row of buckets along the barn wall, cuttings he had taken from the whips that survived, and he watched pale threads of root feel their way down through the cloudy water while the wind worked at the tin outside. When the ground softened enough in early spring, he carried them down and pressed them into the gaps the freeze had opened, tamping each one firm with the heel of his boot the way he always had. He had barely finished that when the cattle got into them. A section of the temporary fencing he had strung along the bank came loose in a wet stretch, and before he found the gap, a dozen head had wandered through and trampled a run of new plantings into the mud. He stood looking at the churned ground and the broken shoots and felt, for one bad moment, the whole thing tilting toward pointlessness. Then he fixed the fence. He replaced what had been ruined. He did the only thing that had ever been available to him, which was the next thing, and then the thing after that. Spring brought aphids to the new growth, clusters of them working the tender shoots, and a dry spell late in the season left the creek low and listless, and the exposed bank cracking in the heat. Two of the saplings nearest the wide curve simply gave up and went brown, and Elijah pulled them and planted fresh cuttings in their place, pressing these deeper than the last and firming the soil tighter, as though he could make up in care what the weather kept taking in luck. The county, of course, saw only the struggling, patchy line, and drew the conclusion it had been waiting to draw. Gus Whitfield came past on his tractor one morning in early summer, slowed at the sight of the thin, surviving saplings, and shook his head. "Might as well have planted broom handles," and drove on. It stung more than the boy let show, because it was the same thing the videos had said months before. And here it was again in a grown man's mouth, and part of Elijah could not help hearing it as the verdict the whole county had already reached. There were days he wondered whether Whitfield was right. The willows that had made it through the freeze were pencil thin and slow was hard to have faith in. Slow gave a person too much time to imagine being wrong. But he had made his choice back in the cold at the start of it all, and he had meant it, and a choice that only held in good weather was not worth making. So he kept his attention where it belonged. He learned to read the survivors, to tell which of the thin whips were merely small and which were quietly building something underneath. He noticed that the ones down near the water, the ones with their feet always wet, were putting out more growth than the ones set higher on the bank, and he filed that away the way he filed everything away, without fuss, as a thing the land had told him that might matter later. By the end of that first hard year, the line along Coldwater Creek looked like a failure to anyone who glanced at it from the road. Elijah did not glance at it from the road. He knelt in the mud beside it, and he saw the roots. The second year was the one that changed things, though it changed them quietly, the way the important things on a farm almost always change. The willows that had come through the first winter had stopped merely surviving and started to grow. Elijah could see it by midsummer, standing back from the bank for once instead of kneeling in it. Where a year before there had been a ragged, doubtful scattering of sticks, there was now something a person could honestly call a line, a thickening run of green following the water's bend, the long leaves trailing in the current wherever the creek ran high enough to reach them. The trees had a shape now. They had presence. When the wind came off the water, it moved through them the way it moves through something established, something that intends to stay. More than that, they had roots, and the roots were the whole point. Elijah could not see them, but he could read them the way he read everything else, through their effects. The bank beneath the willows had stopped shedding soil the way the bare stretches still did after a hard rain. Where the trees stood, the edge held its shape. He knelt one afternoon and worked his fingers into the wet ground near a 2-year trunk and felt just under the surface the beginning of the net Lester Bowen had promised him, fibrous and dense and reaching. It was exactly what the old man had described on that summer evening 2 counties over, and feeling it with his own hand was a different thing entirely from reading it on soft paper. He had trusted the mechanics of it before. Now he could touch them. But knowing a thing and proving it were still 2 different matters, and this was the part that gnawed at him through that second summer. The roots were doing their work, he was sure of it, but they were doing it where no one could see, and there had been no test large enough to make the difference plain. The creek had behaved itself. It had run high a few times and stayed inside its banks, and a quiet creek proved nothing to anyone. The county had mostly stopped laughing, not because it had changed its mind, but because the joke had gotten old, and a forgotten thing is not the same as a vindicated one. Elijah had not done the work to be forgotten. He had done it to be right, out loud, where the ground could say it for him. And the ground, so far, had stayed silent. He was 18 now, and the 2 years he had promised the Willows had nearly run their course, and he found himself in the strange position of having built exactly what he set out to build and having no way to show it mattered. A part of him almost wished for a hard rain, and then felt ashamed of the wish, because he knew what a hard rain cost the people it fell on. He did not have to wish long. The weather that summer had gone strange in a way the older farmers muttered about at the co-op. It had been one of the driest stretches anyone could remember, the ground gone pale and hard, the creek dropped to a thin, listless ribbon in its bed. And then the forecasts began to shift. The weather reports that came over the radio in the mornings stopped talking about drought and started talking about a pattern moving in. An unusual amount of moisture backing up against the mountains to the east, the kind of setup that did not resolve gently. The word that kept coming up was one nobody wanted attached to Coldwater Creek: flooding. Not the ordinary kind that took a corner of somebody's meadow every few years, the kind the county measured against the worst years in living memory. Rufus Dinkins, who farmed the bottomland a couple of miles east and had watched that creek his whole life, told Marcus Brooks at the co-op that if the reports held, they were looking at the highest water since 1993. Marcus brought that home to the supper table, and the family ate quietly with it sitting among them. Elijah understood, better than anyone at that table, what the coming rain would mean, and the understanding sat oddly in him, part dread and part something he did not have a clean word for. The creek he had planted along did not just run through his family's land. It bent away past the pasture and ran on toward town, down through the low ground where the road crossed and the houses started, and if it broke loose in the wrong place, it would not stop at a ruined meadow. The test he had told himself he did not want was coming whether he wanted it or not, and it was going to be bigger than his family's bank. It was going to reach the whole town. The rain came the way real trouble usually comes, not all at once, but steadily, patiently, until the patience of it was the frightening part. It started on a Tuesday and did not stop. Not a cloudburst, not the kind of storm that spends itself in an hour and leaves the air scrubbed and bright. This was a low gray ceiling that settled over the county and stayed, dropping water hour after hour, day after day, soaking into ground that had been so dry it could not take it fast enough. The pale, hard fields went dark and then went soft, and the water began to stand where water had not stood all summer, and Coldwater Creek, which had been a thin ribbon a week before, filled and rose and turned the color of the earth it was carrying. Elijah watched it climb. He went down to the water each morning before the bus and again each evening, and each time the creek had taken more of the space it had been denied, running deeper and faster and browner than the time before. On the 4th day of the rain, he saw that the killdeer were gone. The birds that nested near the water and fed along the gravel had pulled back well uphill, off the creek entirely, moved on ahead of anything a person could yet see coming. He had learned long ago to trust what the animals did over what the sky pretended, and the killdeer clearing out told him more than the radio did. He said nothing about it to anyone. There was nothing to say that would help, and a boy who had spent 2 years being laughed at for reading the water did not go around announcing what the birds were telling him. He only walked the Willow line twice that day, slower than usual, and pressed his hand flat against the trunks the way another person might have laid a hand on the shoulder of someone about to do hard work. Beneath the bark, he could feel the trees taking the strain, the whole living line of them leaning into the rising push of the water, the roots drawn tight beneath the soil like cables under load. Whatever they were going to do, they were doing it now, down where no one could watch. By the end of that week, the county had seen enough to act. A flood advisory came down from the emergency office, and then something firmer than an advisory, and word went around that the low-lying part of town, the streets nearest where the creek came through, were being asked to clear out until the water crested. Families along the bottom loaded what mattered and moved to higher ground, and to the church hall on the hill. And the mood in the county shifted from grumbling to something quieter and more watchful. Marcus Brooks took the notice that had been handed around and nailed it to the barn door, and the family ate that night to the sound of rain drumming steady on the tin roof overhead. Even then, with the water rising and the town half emptied, there were people who could not make themselves believe that a line of trees mattered. Elijah heard it secondhand, the way he heard most things, that down at the co-op and around the church, a few of the older men had said what they had been saying for 2 years, only with more edge now that it counted. A creek at flood did what it wanted. It always had. A handful of skinny willows against water coming off the mountains was a boy's idea of an answer, and a boy's idea was not going to hold a bank that grown men had watched give way all their lives. The thing had gotten too serious for jokes, and the seriousness had not changed their minds. It had only hardened them. Elijah did not argue because there was nothing left to argue with. The willows would answer or they would not, and the water would ask its questions soon, and no opinion at the co-op would weigh a single pound against what happened along that bank when the creek came over. He had stopped needing to be believed a long time ago. What he needed now was for the thing he had built to be true, and whether it was true had passed out of his hands and into the roots the day he pressed the last cutting into the mud. He sat at the window that night with his supper going cold in front of him and listened to the rain that would not stop, and he waited, along with the rest of them, for the creek to make up its mind. It came on a Thursday night, in the dark, the way the worst of it always seems to. Elijah did not sleep. He lay listening to the rain change its voice on the roof, and somewhere past midnight he heard it under the rain, a low, steady rushing that had not been there before, a sound with weight in it, the sound of a great deal of water moving fast where a thin creek used to be. He did not go down to it. There was no going down to it, not in that dark and that current, and his mother had made him promise as much, and for once he did not test the promise. He lay in the sound of it, and imagined the line of trees standing in the black water, taking the whole force of the mountains coming down, and he did not know whether they were holding or whether they were already gone. Morning came gray and wet and showed the county what the night had done. Coldwater Creek had broken loose. It had jumped its banks in 4 places along the valley, and the water had gone where water goes when nothing holds it, out across the low ground in wide brown sheets, carrying fence and topsoil and whatever else had stood in the way. Gus Whitfield lost 60 feet of his north bank clean, the fence that had run along it simply gone. A raw, new edge cut where his pasture used to reach. 3 of the Atchison fence lines were down, the posts and wire dragged and tangled in debris a couple of 100 yards downstream. The low road that ran toward town was underwater, and the crossing where the creek came through toward the houses had become the thing everyone had feared, a place where the current was working at the bank with all its weight, looking for a way through to the streets beyond. That was the part that turned Elijah's stomach when the word reached the farm. It was not only the ruined meadows and the lost fence, bad as those were, it was that the creek, once it was loose, was leaning hard toward the low ground where the town began, And if the bank there gave the way the others had given, the water would find a new channel straight down into the emptied streets, and the flood advisory that had cleared those houses would become the reason they had cleared them. And through all of it, small against the size of what was happening, ran the boys' line of willows. Elijah got down to the edge of the high pasture as soon as there was light enough and footing enough to do it, and he stood where the ground still held and looked at the water where his trees should have been. And for a long, sick stretch of time, he could not tell what he was seeing. The creek was enormous and violent and the color of clay, and it had risen up over the lower trunks so that the willows stood in the current to their waists, bent hard downstream, thrashing, the long branches raking the surface of the water as it tore past. They looked, in that first gray light, like something being torn away. He could see the water pushing at them, could see individual trees leaning until it seemed certain they must go, and he had no way from where he stood to know whether the roots beneath them were holding the bank or whether the bank was already opening up underneath, and only the tops of the trees were left to show where it had been. Everything he had spent 2 years on was down there in that brown water, and he could not reach it, and he could not help it, and he could not even see clearly enough to know if it still existed. The freeze he had fought, the cattle, the aphids, the dry spell, the buckets of cuttings rooting along the barn wall all through that first hard winter, the laughing he had carried and the choice he had made in the cold at the very start of it, all of it was in the balance now, in a place he could not go, and there was nothing left for him to do about any of it. He stood there in the rain with his hands useless at his sides and watched the willows fight the water, and he let himself believe in that moment that he had lost, that the county had been right all along, that the creek had done what the creek always did, and that when the water finally fell, it would show him the same ruin it had shown everyone else, only this one would be his, running the length of everything he had tried to build. The rain thinned toward dawn, and then, by the middle of that Friday morning, stopped altogether, and the county came out into the wet gray light to count what it had lost. It was worse than the ordinary years, and everyone knew it before they had walked 100 yards. The low ground east of town had gone under, and the water was slow to leave it. The bottomland that Rufus Dinkins had spent a dozen years building up, dark, loose soil that had taken more patience than money to make, lay under a skin of brown water, and where the water had already pulled back, it had taken the best of the topsoil with it. Fences were down along half the valley. The crossing where the road came into town sat under a foot of standing water, and the people who had cleared the low streets stood up on the higher ground by the church and looked down at their emptied houses and waited to learn whether they still had them. Because that was the question that hung over everything as the morning wore on. It was not only the meadows and the fences, which were bad enough. It was that the creek, once it had broken loose in the dark, had leaned its whole weight toward the low bank above the town, and if that bank had given way in the night, the water would have cut itself a new road straight down into the streets that the advisory had emptied. Nobody up on the hill yet knew which way it had gone. They only knew that the current had been working at that bank all night with more force than anyone had seen in their lifetimes, and that the men who had watched Coldwater Creek the longest did not like its chances. Marcus Brooks walked out toward the high pasture with his son that morning, and Denise came behind them, and none of them said much, because there was nothing to say that the water had not already decided. Elijah went ahead of his parents to the edge of the ground that still held firm, to the place where the night before he had watched his willows thrash in the black current and let himself believe they were gone. He almost could not make himself look. 2 years of it were down there, and the last clear picture he had of the trees was of them bent to their waists in the flood, leaning until it seemed certain they must tear loose, and he had carried that picture through a sleepless night and into the morning. Some part of him had already begun to prepare for the worst, for the sight of his whole bank carried off, the same wound the flood had opened in every stretch of ground his neighbors owned, only running the length of everything he had built. The rest of the county half expected it too, though for the opposite reason. They had never believed the trees could matter, and the flood that had ruined grown men's banks would only prove, finally and for good, what they had said about the boy from the start. So the whole thing had come down to what the water had done to that one stretch of bank in the dark, and no one, not Elijah and not the men who had laughed at him, yet knew the answer. The Willows had either held the town's edge or they had failed it. The bank was either still there beneath the falling water, or it had opened in the night and sent the creek down into the streets. Everything the story had been building toward for 2 years stood on that single unseen fact, and the fact was still hidden under the last of the brown water as Elijah came up to the edge of the high pasture and made himself lift his eyes and look down at the place where his trees had stood. For a moment the light was still bad and the water still high, and he could not tell. The creek was falling, but it was not yet fallen, and the surface was ugly with debris, and the far bank was a smear of mud and wreckage where the Whitfield fence had been. He stood there with his heart going hard and his parents quiet behind him, and he searched the churning line where his willows should have been, looking for the shape of loss he had spent all night learning to expect. Then the light shifted, or the water dropped another inch, or his eyes finally made sense of what they were seeing, and Elijah understood that the willows were still there. The whole line of them was standing, not untouched, not unmarked, but standing. Where the flood had gone over them in the night, they were bent and mud-caked and stripped of half their leaves. Their branches hung with the rack the water had carried, some of them leaning downstream at angles they would never fully straighten from. But they were rooted where he had planted them, every stretch of the line still holding to the bank, and the bank was still there beneath them. That was the thing that took the breath out of him. The bank was still there. Along the whole bending run where he had pressed his cuttings into the mud 2 years before, the edge held its shape, dark and soaked and battered but whole. While 100 yards across the water, the Whitfield bank showed the raw, new place where 60 feet of it had been carried off. He went down to it as soon as the footing let him, and he knelt at the edge the way he had knelt 1,000 times, and he put his hand into the wet ground beneath the trees, and he felt it. The net was there. 2 years of root had laced through the subsoil exactly as Lester Bowen had said it would on that summer evening 2 counties over. Fibrous and dense and reaching, and when the flood had risen up and thrown its whole weight against the bank, it had not met a wall it could break. It had met something that bent and held. The roots had taken the lateral force of all that water and answered it not with resistance, but with give, flexing under the load, and the soil they gripped had stayed where it belonged. The willows had slowed the current along the edge until it dropped the sediment it was carrying instead of tearing more away, so that in places the bank had actually gained ground in the night, while every unplanted stretch along the valley was losing it. And because that run of bank had held, the creek had not been able to do the one thing the whole town had feared. It had not cut itself a new channel. Held in its bed along the low ground above the houses by the very trees the county had laughed at for 2 years, the water had stayed where the creek had always run, high and violent but contained, and it had gone on down through its old course instead of breaking sideways into the emptied streets. The green line Elijah had built had become the wedge that kept the flood in its channel, holding the creek back from the road and the houses in the low part of town at the one place and the 1 hour it would have mattered most. By that afternoon, the water had dropped enough that a person could see the shape of what had happened, and people began to come and look. They came up along the high pasture in 2s and 3s, farmers who had spent the morning counting their own losses, and they stood at the edge of the brook's bank and looked at the trees standing in the falling water, and at the whole unbroken run of earth beneath them. And then they looked across at the ruined banks on either side, and they did the arithmetic without anyone having to do it for them. Gus Whitfield came on the Monday, when the water had gone down and the mud had started to set. He came up from his own place with his boots still caked from the ruined north pasture, the 60 feet of bank he would be rebuilding for the rest of the year, and he stood a long time at the edge of the Brooks line without saying anything at all. He looked at the willows bent and holding. He looked at the bank they had saved. He was a man who had told the boy to his face that he might as well have planted broom handles, and he was standing now on the proof that he had been wrong about it in every particular, and there was no easy way for a man like that to say so. In the end, he did not try to make a speech of it. "Where'd you get 'em, son?" "The Willows." "How's a fella go about starting something like that?" Elijah told him about the conservation nursery 2 counties over and wrote the name down on a scrap of paper, and Gus Whitfield folded it once and put it in his chest pocket, and that was the whole of the apology, and it was enough. The county did not change all at once because counties never do, but it changed. Word of what had held and what had not went around the way useful things always go around a farming community, quietly, through observation and need rather than announcement. The men who had stood at the edge of the Brooks Bank and done the arithmetic carried it home with them, and by the following spring, the Willows had begun to spread along Coldwater Creek the way they spread everywhere, one length of bank at a time. The Atchisons planted a run along their stretch where the flood had dragged their fences into the debris. Rufus Dinkins put in a line above his ruined bottomland, determined not to lose it a second time. Farm by farm, all down the low ground where the creek ran on toward town, the bare cuttings went into the mud, and the people pressing them in were the same people who had laughed 2 years before, though nobody mentioned that part now. The town took it up as well in its slower, official way. The talk of what the boys' trees had done at the crossing reached the people who made such decisions, and before the year was out there was a program to restore the creek banks through the low part of town with native planting, and the stretch Elijah had put in along his family's land was held up, without irony now, as the first working example of it, the place people were taken to see when they wanted to understand what the plan was for. Elijah did not make anything of it. He had never done the work to be thanked, and the thanks, when it finally came, sat a little strangely on him. He did not go around reminding people that he had known because he had not needed them to believe him for 2 years, and he did not need it now. The bank had said it for him, plainly, in the one language the county had always trusted, and there was nothing he could add to that. When people asked him how he had known, he mostly told them about Lester Bowen, and the raw, scooped-out bank 2 counties over, and the thin pamphlet soft at the edges that he still had on the shelf in his room. He gave the credit up the line, to the old man and to the plain mechanics of a willow root, because that was where he felt it honestly belonged. The trees are still there. They are taller now and thicker through the trunk, and their roots go down a little deeper every year, lacing further into the bank that they will go on holding long after the flood that proved them has faded into one more story told at the co-op. That is not a figure of speech. It is only how willows work. A root does not know or care who planted it, or what was said about the boy who did, or how long the county took to come around. It only goes on doing the quiet work it was made for, down where no one is watching, holding the ground together against the day the water rises. And here is the part worth carrying home from all of it. A whole town was ready to laugh a young man out of an idea, not because they had studied it and found it wanting, but because of who he was and how little they expected of him. They mistook slow for wrong and quiet for foolish, and they very nearly mistook it right up until the water taught them otherwise. Elijah Brooks never needed them to be sorry. He only needed to be right, and to keep working while he waited to be. And that turned out to be the whole of it. The best ideas rarely arrive with proof attached. They ask you to believe in the reason before you can point to the result. And they ask you to keep believing through the freeze and the trampling and the dry spell and the long stretch when nothing you have done shows above the surface. The work that saves us is almost always the work no one can see yet. So the next time you catch yourself ready to write somebody off, the young one, the quiet one, the one from the small place at the end of the road, remember the willows. Remember that the roots that hold the whole thing together are the ones nobody thinks to look for. And remember that sometimes the most practical thing a person can do looks like foolishness right up until the moment the water comes, and the whole town learns, too late to have laughed, what one patient soul could see that no one else had bothered to look for. If this story stayed with you, do us a small kindness and let us know down in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and tell us about the quiet, patient person in your own life, the one who kept working when nobody understood why. We read them and we love hearing them. If you're new here, come join the family and subscribe, and we'll see you out along the next fence line. Thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of your ground and take care of each other.